Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to some supernatural urban legends. Calls from beyond. A middle-aged man was on a train to Los Angeles on his way to do a job interview. He'd recently become engaged and he hoped that the job would allow the pair to marry. At 4:30 p.m, the vehicle collided at 85 miles per hour with a freight train running in the opposite direction. One of the worst accidents in American history. His fiancée heard about the crash while driving to the train station with the man's parents and his siblings. Several of his loved ones received calls from the man's mobile phone, so they naturally assumed that he had survived the accident, even though all they could hear when they picked it up was static. Although their subsequent calls to him went straight to voicemail. All through the night they waited for confirmation that he'd been found alive and well. 12 hours after the accident, having tracked the signal from his mobile phone, rescuers finally located him in the wreckage. He died instantly in the crash. And yet, 35 calls had been made from his phone, only to his nearest and dearest, as if the mobile had been reaching out to help lead them to his body. Midnight Fair. A taxi driver working the night shift on a quiet Sunday was driving past a hospital. A young girl hailed him down and hurried into the car to get out of the rain. She was wearing a hood, and her hair partly obscured her face. She requested that he take her to a lake nearby, which he thought was odd, but he reasoned that perhaps she lived near it. She didn't answer any of his questions, so he drove to the destination in silence, along with the rain drumming on the car. When they arrived, she asked him to wait for her, and she disappeared into the darkness. He waited for a long time, not wanting to abandon the girl out there on her own. Finally, she returned and asked to be taken to a new address, this time to a neighbourhood that the driver knew. When they arrived, the girl got out of the car without paying the fare, disappeared inside a house. Annoyed, the driver got out of the taxi and knocked on the door. An elderly man opened it, but there appeared to be no sign of a girl. When the driver asked about his mysterious passenger, the old man said there were no children in the house. But then he explained something. He once had a daughter, but she drowned in the lake in a car accident with a boyfriend many years earlier. He said that sometimes her spirit caught a cab to look for him in the lake before returning to her childhood home. The old man asked, worried, "You didn't get to look at her face, did you?" The driver replied that he had not, and the old man smiled. Good. He then paid the fare and closed the door. When the taxi driver got back in the car, he saw that in the place where the girl had sat down was a puddle of black water. No honor. Japanese children are often told the story of the keen swimmer who went for a dip every day in the lake near his house in the mountains. Usually, he was the only person there, and he swam early in the morning when the water was very cold. One day, he thought he saw someone else in the lake, but as he approached the water, he realized that they weren't swimming, they were drowning. It was a young woman, waving her hands silently above the surface of the lake. So he dived right in and swam powerfully to her rescue. As he got closer, he saw the girl's long black hair swirling around her as she slipped beneath the choppy waters. He moved to grab her, but suddenly his legs felt heavy, and he could barely move his arms. He couldn't understand what was happening, but then he noticed something strange. The girl was no longer struggling, but staring directly at him with black eyes. As he desperately tried to keep his head above water, he realized that instead of hands, she had claws, and instead of legs, she had the body of a great snake, which was wrapping itself around his torso and dragging him down into the depths. He was never seen again. Being a hero can definitely have its dire consequences. The next story is called Clack, Clack. An American boy was sleeping over at a friend's house. They were both trying to outdo each other with telling scary stories. He'd seen all of his older brother's scary movies, so he wasn't that impressed with what he had heard so far. Then his friend's cousin turned up. heard what game they were playing and, despite their protestations, sat down and joined in. He told them about a girl who was waiting for a train in a high school prom night, when she saw a group of her friends on the other side of the tracks. Not wanting to be left out, she ran over the crossing just as the train was coming, and the wheels cut her in half at the waist. Ever since, people had reported seeing her legless ghost at the school, especially on prom nights. When it was said that she would have been cut in half at the body, and anybody who heard the story would only see her in 1 month's time. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense, but that's how the story goes. A few weeks later, the boy was walking home from school when a girl appeared over a wall and smiled at him. He smiled back and continued on his way when he heard a strange clack, clack noise behind him. He looked around in horror. The girl was crawling over the wall, dragging herself on bony elbows. As she dropped to the floor, he saw that she had no legs, and when she started crawling towards him, her elbows made the spine-chilling clack, clack noise as she gained on him. He didn't turn up at school the next day, and he was never seen or heard from again. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It skips a bit, I think. The book didn't really make sense the first little part. But anyway, the next story is The Doll. For decades, a small doll kept at a temple in Hokkaido Prefecture, Japan, has captured the attention of Japanese people. The story goes that the doll, which has black hair and black eyes, wears a traditional kimono, was the favourite of a little girl who died tragically young in the 1920s. The girl carried the doll everywhere she went. After her premature death, the family placed her favourite toy in an altar in her memory. The girl had cropped the doll's hair short to look just like her own, and people would often comment that it looked suspiciously like its owner. Not long afterwards, the family noticed that the doll's hair appeared longer than it had been, although they dismissed the notion as a figment of their imagination. Eventually, they couldn't ignore the fact the hair was growing. When it reached the doll's knees, the family, suspecting some insensitive prank, cut the doll's hair so that it was short again. But of course, it only grew back longer. The family eventually placed the mysterious toy in the local temple, where it remains to this day. The monks at the temple cut the doll's hair on a regular basis, and it always grows back. Many years after the doll arrived at the temple, the hair was tested and found to be that of a young child. Wowzers. Creepy. Dolls are creepy anyway, let's be honest. The next is Tunnel Visions. A busy highway in Tokyo, Japan, runs through a tunnel that lies underneath a very large and very old cemetery. The graveyard is not visible when driving a car underneath, but many drivers are said to have felt its presence over the years. A man driving back from a late shift at work one night narrowly avoided hitting what he swore was a young mother with a small child. For after he managed to get his car under control and swerved to stop, he saw that there was nobody there. His friends blamed the lack of sleep, but he was sure that he had indeed seen somebody in the middle of that road. People in the know would say that he witnessed one of the sinister spirits emanating from the graveyard above and becoming trapped in the tunnel, stuck between this world and the afterlife. On more than one occasion, drivers, usually male, have described how they glanced in their rearview mirror and caught sight of a young girl with long black hair on the back seat, staring straight at them. If they managed to keep their car on the road and checked again, they would find there was nothing there. Other reports include people hanging upside down or banging on car roofs, and mysterious handprints and faces appearing on windows. The area's taxi drivers are particularly wary. All of them know the stories of cabs being hailed by people in the tunnel, only for them to disappear once the door is opened. The next story is Hanako-san. Anybody who grew up in the West knows the legend of Bloody Mary, who will appear if you say her name 3 times in a mirror, in a darkened room. The Japanese have their own version. You must go into an empty girl's bathroom, Knock on the door of the last cubicle 3 times, and then ask aloud, "Are you there, Hanako-san?" When you open the door, you will see a young girl who was brutally murdered in high school bathroom many years before. She always wears a red skirt. The next is Benjamin's house. At the turn of the 20th century, a wealthy family bought an old mansion in the southwest of England, high in the cliffs in a remote location, overlooking the sea. They lived with their young child, a boy named Ben, and several servants. Stories would reach the local villagers, who rarely saw the inhabitants of the house, that the owners were distant and cruel to their staff, who had little other choice of employment in the area. The devoutly religious lady of the house singled out one of the maids, a young cook, for particular cruel treatment, claiming that the girl was evil and that she was corrupting the rest of the staff. The maid would often return late from her weekends off, and the other servants liked to gossip. They said she was a harlot, a liar, and even a witch. She was a strong-minded girl, and instead of denying the rumours, she played up to the stories told about her. When the boy's father found her performing strange rituals in the grounds of the house, she was beaten and dismissed. Before she left, she offered a doll to the boy, who had always liked her despite his parents' suspicions, as a peace offering. His parents were all for throwing it away, but the boy liked it. In fact, it became an instant favourite, and he even named it after himself, Benjamin. He dressed the doll in clothes to match his own, but never let it out of his sight. Or was it that he was never out of its sight? The boy would often talk to Benjamin in his room alone, even pretending to speak in its voice. His parents thought this behaviour strange, but as he had no friends to speak to and it kept him occupied, they left him be. Occasionally, the servants heard him arguing with the doll in his bedroom. One morning they heard him sobbing uncontrollably from behind a locked door. They told his father, who found the little boy hiding under the bed, because he said that Benjamin couldn't see him there. The father was again ready to get rid of the doll, but the boy pleaded to let him keep it in the house. A rumour started among the servants that the boy was not talking for the doll was talking for itself. It became common to hear loud noises coming from the boy's room at night. When the door was opened, he would claim that Benjamin had done it. One of the following maids reported being followed by the doll and spotting it at different upstairs windows, as if it were watching her work. It was said that the doll's face had a different expression depending on who it was looking, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, sometimes angry. The stories eventually caught the attention of a writer who stayed in the village and decided to investigate. It was rebuffed by the owners, who denied all knowledge, but he persevered. He managed to talk to some of the staff, who told him that the doll had a distinctive piercing laugh, which could be heard in the upper floors of the house, and was often spotted sitting in different rooms of the house when the boy wasn't at home. One servant even claimed to have seen it running across the hall. Eventually, the boy grew up, but he never left the house, and he never left Benjamin. When he died many years later, the household wasted no time in banishing the toy to the attic, where it was sometimes glimpsed peering out of the windows. The doll remained in exile upstairs for many years, until the house's new owners moved in. They had a little girl who one day, while roaming in the attic, discovered an old, well-worn doll with a sad look on its face. Soon Benjamin was up to his old tricks. The girl appeared to be terrified of the doll, saying it had attacked her, but she couldn't bear to be parted from it. On one occasion, her older brother beheaded Benjamin with scissors and left it on the floor as a cruel sibling prank, only to find the doll the next day in his bedroom with its head reattached and smiling. Like I said, dolls are creepy. Ew, ew, no thank you. Okay, the next story is The Highgate Vampire. Very well-known urban legend this. In the 1970s, a London newspaper covered a juicy story that was terrifying the residents of a well-to-do suburb in the north of the city. The cast of characters included a top-hatted gentleman thought to be a vampire who had been sighted several times. He apparently escaped from the cemetery each night to find fresh victims, and a vampire hunter with a band of dedicated followers. The paper reported that people walking in Highgate Cemetery, resting place of many famous individuals, including Karl Marx, had seen ghostly figures following them at night. A few days later, it emerged that graves in the cemetery had been disturbed, and the remains of a ritual act were found. Most disturbing, an iron stake had been driven through the lid of a coffin and into a corpse inside. The paper interviewed the self-proclaimed vampire hunter. He claimed that whoever had placed the stake in the coffin was mistaken and that the monster still was at large. Moreover, he declared that he had his followers stalked by the vampire, and he was leaving the cemetery, that the creature was actually the reanimated corpse of an 18th century European gentleman. He had been transported to London in a coffin after his death, and was now possessed by evil spirits. The hunter claimed that he had tracked down the vampire to a great mausoleum in the cemetery, where he had had the chance of putting a stake through his heart as he was sleeping. However, he did not carry out the deed, as it would have been illegal to desecrate a body in such a fashion. But he took the sensational photographs of the creature's evil, contorted face and scattered garlic in the vault. Then the body of the woman was found in the grounds of the cemetery, not far from the mausoleum, causing, well, an even more uproar in the media. Hundreds of people turned up at the cemetery at night after night, in fact, in an attempt to find the vampire. The police had to guard the place for several nights to put the locals' minds at rest. The hunter eventually cornered the vampire in a nearby mansion, where he had found refuge in a coffin. They performed an exorcism, put a stake through the creature's heart, and burned the corpse, thus ending the threat forever. Yes, very well-known urban legend regarding England, guys. The next is called Modern Vampires. In Romania, land of the original Dracula, old habits die hard. Rumours of vampires rising from graves to prey on the living are still popular. In Transylvania in 2004, a group of villagers were worried about someone who had been recently buried. They thought he was responsible for a series of recent attacks in the community and decided to revert to an ancient technique in order to stop the crime spree. They went to the cemetery to dig up the body, which they noticed looked a lot fresher than should be expected. A stake was driven through the heart. Then the organ was cut from the torso and burned, according to tradition. No more attacks were reported. Vampire folklore has a long history in Romania. Home as it was to the man who inspired Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia in the 15th century. Vlad got his nickname because of his habit of impaling captured enemies on stakes, usually their heads. He carried out this practice with so many of his enemies that one visitor to the country described a mighty forest of corpses stuck on stakes that stunk to high heaven. When he complained to the prince, it said that the same visitor was impaled high up, so that the smell of the others would not bother him. It's not just in Eastern Europe that stories of vampires cause people to take drastic action. In rural 19th century New England, an outbreak of tuberculosis took hold, killing many, and the disease tended to kill several members of the same family. Worried locals summarized that the dead were taking others down with them. In order to try to cease the outbreak, they invoked ancient rituals designed to stop vampires. In 1892, the Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island, were hit by the disease. A young girl, Mercy, died, and her mother followed soon afterwards. As inevitable happened with the disease, Mercy's brother also fell ill. The family felt that their only option was to exhume and examine the bodies. The father enlisted the help of villagers for the job and found that Mercy, who had died 2 months previously, looked suspiciously lifelike, and that her heart contained fresh blood. This was a sure sign that she was the vampire to blame for the deaths. So her heart was cut out and ritually burned. The ashes were given to her brother on his sick bed, while others inhaled the smoke in a belief that it would protect them. Unsurprisingly, neither method worked. Of course it wouldn't, it's a disease. The next is the school bus. Several decades ago, an odd story appeared in the local newspaper in a rural region of Wales. On the last day of term, a school bus taking children home was making its usual crossing over a railway line that ran up a mountain. The driver never liked taking the children over the crossing, but he had done it hundreds of times without incident. However, this time something went wrong, and the bus stopped right in the middle of its tracks. As the driver frantically tried to restart the engine, the worst nightmare began to become true. He heard a train sound its horn in the distance. Within seconds, a heavy goods vehicle was incoming and looming large to the window. His first instinct was to save the children, so he leapt from the bus and smashed open the emergency exit. The last thing he heard was a terrible noise as the locomotive brakes screeched in vain and the children screamed as he jumped off the bus. The last thing he saw was the train driver above him, shielding his eyes as he awaited the inevitable. The train obliterated the bus, but by some miracle, only the bus driver lost his life. Over time, the small mining community slowly forgot about the accident until a recent story appeared in the same paper. It reported that an elderly man, a retired teacher, was driving over the same railway crossing when his car stalled on the tracks. The alarm began to sound, and panic grew as he fumbled with his seatbelt. Just as he opened the door and the guardrails lowered behind him, he felt the car shift as though it was being lifted up from underneath. And the next thing he knew, the train was thundering past behind him, so close that it rocked the car. He was shaken that he had to get out of his vehicle and call his wife to drive him home, which is when he checked the back of the car for damage. The train had missed it by a foot. It was also at that moment that he noticed the marks on the boot of his car. There were bloody handprints. The man looked around in panic, but there was no one else in sight. And that's the original story of the idea of seeing the hands push car up roads. There's loads of different urban legends regarding that now, and it's usually the children that's pushing it. But the original story was that it was a man that saved the children, and it's him that pushes the car over. So you can see the differences and how it's changed over time, because I'm sure you can research it and you'll see there are a lot of urban legends now, and usually it's children pushing the car. The original one was just a man. But there you go. The next is called Red Paper. Japanese children scare each other by repeating the tale of what happened to two schoolboys many years ago. One day, one of the boys went to the bathroom, only to find that there was no toilet paper in the store. As he cursed to himself, he heard a voice asking him whether he wanted red or blue paper. He answered red, and all the blood seeped out of his body, so that he died in minutes. The story spread around the school. Some months later, the boy's friend found himself in the same toilet stall, and again there was no paper. He heard the same voice ask him what paper he would like. Knowing the story, and remembering what happened to his friend, he chose blue. Gradually, his throat began to tighten, and soon he was struggling to breathe. Classmates found him dead, blue in the face from suffocation. The next story is called The Survivor. One sunny summer day, a young couple were driving down to the coast for a holiday. They had left the town and were winding through the hills when they noticed a woman at the side of the road, flagging them down. She looked distressed and her clothes were covered in blood, so they quickly pulled over and asked her what had happened. She struggled to get the words out. She appeared to have an injury to her neck and was in pain. They finally established that she and her family had been in a car crash, although there was no vehicle visible for the road. The woman pointed over the side of the valley, saying that the car was somewhere down there, and her husband was dead, but her baby was trapped in the back seat, and he was still alive when she left him. The man started to climb down the valley through broken trees, while his girlfriend said she would call for help and look after the woman. He saw that the car had rolled a long way down the hill and looked in a very bad way, but as he got closer, he heard the muffled sounds of a young child. The wreckage was terrible, and he could barely see the driver. Although the back door was bent into the frame, he tugged with all his might and managed to wrench it open. He was able to pull the screaming baby out and carry him back up the hill. As he hurried back to his girlfriend, he noticed that the woman was no longer with her. "Where did she go?" he asked. "She went to see a baby. I tried to stop her," replied his girlfriend. So the man handed the baby over and returned to the crash site to find the boy's mother. And there was no sign of her. He checked the rest of the vehicle. He hauled the smashed windscreen out of the way and saw that the driver was clearly beyond help, so he turned his attention to the passenger, and what he saw took his breath away. It was the mother who had flagged them down, clearly dead, and trapped in the wreckage all that time. And again, that's a well-known urban legend also. The next is called Esmeralda. Around 100 years ago, a sensational story filled the papers in Nottingham, England. A young Roma girl named Esmeralda, who was visiting the area with her family, was raped one night, and the attacker was never found. It was said that the police weren't bothered about the fate of the traveller. When the papers didn't know was that she had fallen pregnant after the attack and gave birth to a child, but he was horribly deformed and didn't survive his first year. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the field on the borders of the city. Esmeralda was said to have visited the place every time she came through the area with her family until she was middle-aged. On one occasion, she found that the grave had been dug up, the coffin opened and the body taken. After struggling to deal with the memories of her ordeal for many years, the shock of the discovery tipped her over the edge and she lost her mind. Esmeralda was shunned by a community and ended her days in a cruel asylum in the city. The story was forgotten, and the field became a children's playground after the war. For many years, locals had reported strange happenings at the site. Some described the sounds of a baby crying, or something like the shrieks of a fox or a feral cat. Children playing would find the mutilated remains of animals, such as birds, cats, once even a large dog. A newspaper reported warned parents that a young girl had been approached by an old woman wearing strange clothes who had asked if she had seen her child, and then had muttered a curse when the girl ran off. One night in the 1960s, a man was walking his dog, a German Shepherd, through the park. The dog was running off the leash when his owner heard him growling somewhere in the darkness. He'd called for him, scared that he might bite a stranger. But then came a terrible yowling. The animal raced back to his side, whimpering. It had a vicious gash on its nose and was limping. Then the man heard something wailing from the trees, like nothing he'd heard before, and caught sight of something moving quickly across the ground towards him. He didn't wait to see what it was, and he ran home as fast as he could. The next story is called The Woman in White. A group of children were playing in a river in their hometown in Mexico City, a place they usually visited to let off steam. A woman appeared and started to ask them questions. She stood out from the locals because of her appearance. She was dressed in all white and immaculately groomed. She spoke quietly and occasionally sobbed, asking the children if they had seen Marcus or Gabriella, whom she called her little babies. One of the boys was called Marcus, but he didn't know the lady, so they ignored her. The woman disappeared as quietly as she had appeared. When the time came to leave the river, the children noticed that Marcus was missing. They assumed that he had gone home by himself and thought nothing of it. But by the next morning, he hadn't turned up, and the whole town was looking for him. He was eventually found, face down in the river. He had drowned. His family assumed he got into trouble while swimming with the others, until one of the children told her mother about the woman in white, and how she had been looking for her children. When Marcus's mother heard the tale, her blood ran cold. She knew who had taken her son. 3 more children from the town disappeared over the following month, and each death was preceded by a sighting of a pale-faced woman in white, asking for her children. Centuries earlier, when the Spanish invaded South America, a beautiful native interpreter became involved with one of the commanders and had 2 children by him. The man eventually married a Spanish woman, shunning his native mistress and their offspring. In her grief she went mad, and drowned the children in the river, before leaping off the bridge herself. She tried to enter heaven, but could not gain access without her children, so she was condemned to roam the earth, trapped between the living and the dead. The legend goes that she wanders the land, looking for her children, taking any she finds that resemble her own, and drowning them, in order to bring them to heaven to try and receive forgiveness for her terrible crimes. And that's like La Llorona, isn't it? The next story is La Mala Hora. Maria from Arizona received a phone call from her best friend, Rosanna, who sounded distraught. Rosanna was breaking up with a boyfriend, and he had left the house in a rage, so she asked if her friend could come and keep her company. As Maria's husband was away on a business trip, she was feeling lonely and decided to accept. It was late, just after midnight, when she left her house in the car. She drove the dark roads that were deserted. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching or following her, but she told herself it was just her mind playing tricks. Halfway to her destination, she stopped at a crossroads, and suddenly a dark shape, like a cloud of smoke, rolled towards her car. Then it disappeared. The lights turned green and she accelerated, but immediately slammed on the brakes when she saw a figure in the road right in front of her. She was small, like a girl, but with the face of an old lady twisted into a hateful grin. Her eyes glowed red, and she bared black and sharpened teeth. She crawled on top of the car and started to scrape and hit the window on the driver's side with clawed hands. Maria put her foot to the floor in sheer terror, and the car lurched away from the crossroads, leaving her attacker on the tarmac. As she sped away from the lights, she realized with horror that the demon woman was still chasing her car, and somehow keeping pace, her talons scraping at the metal with a terrible noise. She accelerated to well over speed limit, her heart pounding. Then the noise stopped. Her heart was hammering in her chest as she watched in the rearview mirror as the figure in the middle of the road was just standing still, but seemed to be closer as before. She was growing towards the sky, and her great claws were so large that they touched the ground. Then the car turned a corner, and she was gone. When Maria reached Rosanna's house, she screeched to a halt, ran up the drive and slammed her fists on the door, shouting to be let in. Her friend opened the door in fright. Maria told her to shut it and lock it. She closed all the curtains and told Rosanna not to look out of the window. "What happened?" Rosanna asked. Maria explained what she had seen on the road. The dark shape, the woman with claws, and how she seemed to grow in the moonlight behind her. Her friend listened quietly, kept looking at her watch, and seemed to know what she was talking about. "Are you sure you were stopped at a crossroads?" "Yes, I'm sure," replied Maria, listening carefully for any noises coming from outside. "It may have been La Marahora," explains Rosanna. "It means the evil hour. They say she appears at crossroads when someone is about to die, and if you manage to escape her grasp, someone you love will die in your place." Maria was horrified, but she tried to make light of it, saying that she must have imagined the whole thing. However, she knew that she hadn't, and she couldn't stop shaking. It took her hours to get to sleep. When she was awoke the following morning, she wondered if it had all been a dream. Rosanna didn't mention anything over breakfast, and Maria slowly forgot about it. Later that day, as she was driving home, her phone kept ringing, but she didn't stop to answer it. She had to pass over the same crossroads on her journey back, but was relieved to find that it was daylight and she wasn't frightened. When she reached home, she saw a police car waiting in the driveway and wondered whether she had been burgled, or maybe her husband had been caught speeding again. The officers got out of the car, but wouldn't tell her anything until they went inside. They asked if she was alone in the house, and she said that her husband. Then they said that her husband had been found dead in his motel. They thought that he had been followed back to his room by a thief, or had forced his way in, stabbed him to death for his wallet. Maria didn't want to believe them, as she had spoken to him last night before, so she asked what time it had happened. "Not long after midnight," the reply came. Yeesh, scary. The next story is called The Psychic. A girl and some friends went to a show put on by a psychic medium at a local theatre. They didn't know if they really believed in those sorts of things, but they thought it might be fun. Who knew? They might even get an insight into their future. One of the friends had been to see the same psychic for a private tarot card reading and been told that she would find the man of her dreams and marry him within 6 months. As that's exactly what happened, maybe there was something to it after all. It was a fun evening, if a little creepy at times. The psychic seemed to be aware of other things that only they and their loved ones knew. The psychic did a reading of the cards for the girls' friends, writing something inside an envelope for each of them, and said that they could open them straight away or later at home. They all tore and opened and read out the predictions: marriage, heartache, and great wealth. Then the psychic asked the girl to come up to stage and laid out the cards. She looked at her with a pained look on her face and claimed that something was stopping her from seeing clearly. Had she lost a loved one recently? The girl replied. Honestly, that she hadn't. The psychic asked her to read her palm instead and trace the lines on her skin, nodding solemnly. I can see your future now, my dear. It's all very clear. She laid down her hand and handed her an envelope that she already had in her pocket. Her friends begged her to open it, but the girl pretended not to be too bothered by the whole affair, saying that she would leave it until she got home. Once the evening ended, the girl bid farewell to her friends and drove home alone. She had pulled onto a main road and was looking at the envelope lying on the passenger seat, thinking about what might be written inside, when she was startled by a blast of a horn and flash of lights. A large lorry had missed the back of her car by inches as she pulled out in front. She breathed a sigh of relief and drove on nervously. Eventually she couldn't resist the temptation any longer, leaned over to pick up the envelope. As she did so, the car drifted slightly over the white dividing lines of the road, just enough for a car coming from the opposite direction to smash into hers and shove it violently into the path of the following truck. She was killed instantly. When the firefighters arrived to cut the body out of the wreckage, they found a bloodied envelope on the floor. It made its way to her family, who decided to open it. The card inside said, "You have no future." Ooh, if I had got a card like that, I'd be like so scared, I swear. That's absolutely freaking terrifying, isn't it? You know? To be told something like that. Oh my days. Heck no. That's really scary, guys. And that's our first lot of paranormal urban legends. Many blessings.